Hi, everybody. Welcome to PhotoCon Hawaii 2020. This is awesome that we're all together this way. 2020 has been an unusual year, but thanks to you and the team at 1117 Creative, Teresa Ang, and all the people that have helped me make this possible, we bring you a great event. Thank you for being here. Today, we have questions on the right-hand side. You can go and you can ask questions. We can answer them, and the speakers will also answer them as well. First of all, I'd like to bring you Murray Elliott. If Murray's there, come on in, and Zac Henderson of Megapixels. Zac is an interesting fella. We've met them. We've been with them together at the last PhotoCon. Great people, very, very experienced in technical cameras. And Zac has this great ability to bring to life a very peculiar camera, and I'll hand it over to them. Murray and Zac, all's yours.
Thank you, Rick. I think we're waiting on Murray a bit. But
and Murray come in?
Yeah, he's on.
Okay, Zac, take it away.
Sure, yeah. So, hey, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. It is my absolute honor to be starting off PhotoCon Hawaii. It's quite the honor, quite the pleasure. So like Rick was saying, my name is Zac Henderson. I am a photographer and videographer traveling full-time across the US. And so, oh, there's Murray.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. I work with Murray, who is CEO of a company called Megapixels Digital out of Michigan. And Murray, I'll let you continue.
Hi, everyone. Again, hey, what Rick said, thank you all for being here. It's great to be in front of everybody. Love to have been there in Hawaii, of course. Been much more fun, but gonna have a wonderful event here today, as well as all the other events throughout the weekend. If anybody has any questions regarding any of the equipment, feel free to put them in the chat room, as well as any questions on Capture One or any of the other products that Phase One offers. I can always be reached as well at murray@megapixelsdigital.com. I'll put that up there in the chat room, so if anybody wants to contact me directly, they can. Again, thank you all for being here, and look forward to the event. Take it away, Zac.
Thanks, Murray. Yeah, so again, an honor to be here. Thank you guys so much for coming in, showing up, and for being present for this talk. It's great that we can do it this way, so it's really exciting that we can still have this move forward. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of info about me, why you're listening to me. Basically, I've been in the photo industry professionally for 8 years, and then I have a degree from the Savannah College of Art and Design, majoring in photography. And essentially throughout my entire career, I've been working with large sensor, medium format camera systems, really high resolution, interesting, strange, and stunning camera systems that are that can be rented, they can be purchased, but no matter how you use them, typically something ends up extraordinary at the end of it, and it's a really exciting thing. And I love talking about and using the XT because it's such a strange, interesting camera, and I think a lot of people don't have the history of kind of where this camera came from and why it's here and what it does so differently. We're going to talk a lot about why this camera looks differently, why it does the things that it does, and how it does the things that it does, because it's not anywhere near like a normal camera. But like I said, I've been fascinated with high-end image quality and interesting camera systems that produce the absolute best. That's kind of where my hemisphere has been around my entire professional career, is sort of gravitating towards camera systems that are really extraordinary and really unique and have potential that truly it goes beyond what a single image can be because of various things like dynamic range, the sheer amount of resolution, and other like newer computational features that really stretch what a photo truly is, and really changes what a single capture is truly capable of. So we're going to talk about essentially all of those things today. As we go through, let us know if you have questions, need me to repeat something. I'm happy to do that. I'm not going to constantly be looking at the chat. I get distracted that way, but do throw some questions in. They'll be flagged, and I will do my very best to get to them as soon as I can. So the reason why we're talking about this camera in relation to landscape photography is because this camera was essentially designed specifically for landscape photography. Now, you can use this camera for a variety of different mediums. It's not like just a landscape camera. It only doesn't just work in front of a mountain or the ocean, but it is really sort of geared towards use in the field, and its very specific feature set lends itself to shooting outdoors and having intense amounts of control over the things that you do. Because if you think about it in terms of like landscape photography itself, if anybody is interested in landscape photography at all, you know that it is really difficult to predict everything. You don't have control over most anything in landscape photography. You can look out at the weather forecast, you can plan for months, years in advance, you can get there right when you're supposed to, but you're still at the mercy of the elements of the day. And that being the case, because there's so much left to chance, no matter what, you want to make sure that you have everything that you can control. You want to make sure that you do have complete control over that. And that's something that this camera gives you. Again, it's about looking at every little detail and being able to resolve every little detail. So whether the final product is an enormous print that's hanging on the wall, or whether it's a huge ad campaign, or whether it's a little tiny web resolution file, you can take a single image from a camera system like this and use that for any number of different purposes, because it has that resolution. What we're looking at in front of us right here is, we'll get into more of this briefly, but this digital back is 150 megapixels. That's a lot of resolution. Every single capture that comes out of this camera is 150 megapixels. And what that does truly is something really unique. When you have that much resolution, you can see intricate little details that you really couldn't pick up with a lower resolution camera system. But that resolution gives you so many additional things to work with, like little small details and finding things. In fact, often in the field, when I'm shooting landscapes, if I'm in the mountains or something, often I'll take an image with a camera system like this and see, like later looking through the image, that there is like a family of deer, like in a little corner that I never saw before. But that it simply being there adds a richness, even if it's not part of the main foreground or the main subject. The fact that it's even there is just a really wonderful thing. And so a camera system like this gives you that kind of detail, and it gives you that kind of control over your camera, over your files, how much you crop in, how much or different aspect ratios. You're not beholden to simply one without enough resolution to make up for it. All of this are things that the XT actually provides for you. So also talking about landscape photography, it's so difficult to do something unique. Everybody's seen the same images of all of their, the main sites and the beautiful country that the USA has. It's popular to go out and make images of it. And so when you go to these places that have been visited so many times, you want to do something unique. You want to do something that is difficult or somebody else hasn't even thought of. And it's a very difficult thing to do. But again, when you have control and when you have the kind of tools that cameras like this give you, you have that much more opportunity to do something different. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. So yeah, again, it's about having that opportunity and putting yourself in the best possible position in a landscape so that you can create that image that you had in your mind for so long. So again, if you're looking at it and this camera design is confusing to you, you're not alone. It's totally normal, because it's not normal at all. The camera design itself is completely different from what you would imagine in like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. Now, technically, this is a mirrorless camera. There's no mirror between the sensor, which is essentially here, and the lens itself. What I would like to do is I would like to kind of break this camera system down, and I want to show you each individual piece because it's completely modular. This, as you see it, is not one item. It's a combination of 3 completely separate items that are designed individually to do the best that they can. And then when they're combined, it really can result in something that's truly, truly extraordinary. So for starters, I'm going to take off the digital back. So this is actually the brains of the camera system. when I talk about high resolution medium format camera systems, this is what I'm referring to. So this is a full frame medium format 150 megapixel digital back. That entire area, that's the sensor. That's the actual light sensitive area, and it's physically like a good bit larger than a 35 millimeter camera system. This is my hand, obviously, for comparison. So you realize that that's a lot of resolution, and that's a lot of surface area. That's a lot of real estate, and that has a very palpable effect on the final image. It looks different. It's not just higher resolution, but depth of field behaves differently. The high dynamic range that's able to be pulled out of a system like that, it looks different. And so that's for starters. So that's the brains of the camera system, and we're going to come back to that a good bit later. But just kind of going over the basics of the camera. What are we even looking at? How do we decipher like what part of this camera is what? So we just removed the digital back, so we're left with the body itself, and we're also left with the lens. I'm going to go ahead and remove the lens. So the lens, this lens probably looks fairly different from what most everybody's accustomed to. So that, for most everyone, this lens looks like nothing you're accustomed to, because there are so few lenses made like this anymore. So this lens style design is called essentially a large format style lens. We have a front element that's connected to a shutter, and then we have a rear element that's sort of in this housing. And so if you remember, for those of you that are around that shot film, large format 4x5, 8x10, 11x14, these styled of lenses, this style of lens, this kind of design is very much reminiscent to the lenses used in those large format film cameras. And I'll talk a little bit more later about why that's the case. But it does look very different. It's very unique looking. Of particular note on the lens, and I think it's important to know this, is that the shutter, which is this piece here, kind of wraps sort of all the way around there. So that's the actual shutter itself. The shutter, phase one, is called the X shutter. And you ask, why would a camera manufacturer name their own shutter? Big whoop, right? What's the big deal? Everybody's got shutters and nobody really brags about them. That's true for the most part, but with the X shutter that phase one has come out with, we'll get to it a little bit later, but briefly, there was a shutter company called Copal, or a type of shutter called the Copal Shutter that was used in those large format styled lenses for years and years and decades, and it was the standard. Well, eventually those ran out, and so large format styled lenses like this one that relied on a Copal shutter that had cocking mechanism, it had shutter speeds, aperture, all adjusted manually from this piece, it became no longer available. It was no longer created and no longer made new. And so essentially the whole industry was like, what are we going to do? Phase one helped develop themselves the X shutter. It came from their industrial sort of side of their company, but it's an enormous deal. Shutters are kind of an integral part of the camera system, and to develop from scratch a totally new styled leaf shutter, that really shouldn't be glossed over. So I do want to mention that, and we'll come back to that when we talk about image circles and some of the movements that this body is capable of. And I guess that's what we'll get to now. So now that the lens has been removed, right? And now that the back has been removed, which is essentially the brains and the sensor and all of the controlling features, this is what we're left with. It kind of looks like a frame, but it's truly far more than that. So this is the actual camera body itself, the camera, as it were. And it kind of has an interesting look, right? I mean, it's sort of bizarre looking. We've got an ebony hand grip on one side, so when you do want to hand hold, you can grab it and move it around. You can feel comfortably, because it's a sort of, holding it another way would feel a little bit odd, feel a little strange, but having a grip is a really nice thing. And also you got a really cool little blue shutter button, which you just absolutely have to love. Not the most important feature, but a favorite of many on the XT. So far, I've talked about resolution and I've talked about lenses, and you may be thinking, all right, what's the big deal so far? Yeah, it's high resolution, but what else makes the XT worth listening to you about? Frankly, most of it anyway, has to do with this section. So the rear, what would typically be called a rear standard on most 4x5 or large format camera systems, it's this little piece of metal behind the body is there we go. It's separated a bit, and it's on a geared thumb drive. So essentially, what this allows you to do is, as you feel like, and as the composition is deemed necessary, you can use rear standard rise, fall, as well as shift movements. So we have roughly 12 degrees of rise and fall movements, and we have roughly 12 degrees of lateral shift movements. This really, if you've shot 4x5 before, then you really know what's going on here. It's essentially the same thing. If you've had a 4x5 folding or field camera or studio camera, you've used movements in the past, you really know what's happening here. For those of you that haven't, don't feel bad, because these are not found very often. A lot of movements like this are really kind of a niche, have a niche place in the photo industry. And they're really, most of the time, geared towards landscape, studio, and architectural photographers, because these movements, they do a few different things, but one of the main things that they do is they help correct perspective. So for example, if you're everyone's done this before, if you're shooting up at a building, right, the top of that building has vanishing lines. They have lines that are converging, and the top is going to be smaller than the bottom. The bottom's larger because it's closer to you, wide angle lens looking up into the sky. That's essentially what happens every time. With a camera system like this that has rear standard movements, including specifically rise and fall, what that does for you is that allows you to correct that perspective. And so that building at the top no longer is smaller, or at the very least is less small, and looks like a much more natural looking image, as if you were looking at it straight on. And it has a very different look to it in a regular image, in a photograph that, you photographed a building like you would normally, and then you're using a camera with perspective correction. It has a different look. It looks different because it doesn't look like you just stood there and looked up, right? And so a lot of architectural photographers, a lot of studio photographers and landscape photographers, but particularly architecture and studio, really make a lot of use of that feature. That corrective ability is really substantial, because the type of images that they're producing, the type of products that they're photographing, including buildings, they have to look a certain way, and they need to be presented in their best light. And if you can do that in camera, that's way better than doing it in post. And I'll tell you why. It's easy enough in Capture One, or pick your software, to bring an image in that has keystoning. It's called keystoning, by the way, that smallness at the top of a building and the largest at the bottom. So if you've got, it's easy to correct keystone in post-production. Line up the lines, you ask the computer to do some math, and suddenly you've got an image that looks like you had this camera in the field. The problem with that is that there's actually some cropping happening as you do that keystone correction. If you look and you see how your image is being warped to make that correction happen, you'll notice that it is sometimes drastically being cropped. And so while you may have started at 50 megapixels, after that keystone correction, you may be down to 24 megapixels. And if your goal is to have an enormous print on the wall that shows every last detail of what it is that you're photographing, then you're losing a little bit of that resolution. Whereas if you have the ability to do it out in the field, then you don't have to crop at all. You have all of that resolution available at your fingertips. And so that's how you get these enormous prints, if you've seen them before, enormous 30 by 40 inch plus, larger than that, prints made by cameras like this that just brim with detail. And no matter how close you get to it, you see that level of definition. It doesn't fall apart, which happens with large prints that have been upscaled. So anyway, that's a long tangent talking about shifting and rise and fall movements, but that's what it's all about. Not only, so these movements, so these 12 degrees or 12 millimeters of lateral shift, 12 degrees of rise and fall, those are great for perspective control, but they're also great for stitching. Stitching is like panoramic stitching is what I'm referring to. And just so that we're not looking at this at the body anymore, I'll go ahead and put the lens and back on. While I do that, if you guys have questions about anything, you want me to go talk about something again real quick, go ahead and throw it in while I put the lens and digital back on. Not that it's going to take very long, but let's see. All right, we've got one question coming in. Cool. We'll get to that in just a sec. There you are. Okay. Sure. So we had a question about frame averaging, and that's one of the computational features that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation, because this digital back, essentially the entire, like I mentioned before, the entire brains of the camera system, this digital back controls it all. But it also has some insane, absurd computational photographic features that are absolutely worth mentioning. It's interesting when you talk about a camera system like this, because each piece being so modular, even the back is modular in its firmware. As firmware gets loaded into the digital back, phase one has the entire ability to change how this camera operates, including adjusting ISO performance, image quality even, introducing new tools, making the camera work in a way that it never worked before. And so one of those features that was introduced was the frame averaging function. What it does is kind of in the name, but I'm going to talk about it later, I promise. So looking at the camera itself, now that it's all back together, we have, again, like I mentioned, the digital back. This is the brains. Now, there have been cameras like this made in the past. The Phase 1 XT is not the only camera like this. Typically, when we refer to cameras like the XT, we're calling them technical cameras. The reason they're called technical cameras is because they have the ability, the built-in ability to do things like perspective correction, integrated rise and fall and shift. Those things, as well as some will also have tilt and swing lenses. That's actually an option with the XT as well. And so when you have all of those things built into a camera system, it really truly becomes the technical camera. The XT is not the only technical camera to have ever lived around. It's not the only one that's ever existed. Technical cameras have been around for a while, and they've been used with high resolution digital backs for a long time. The issue that older technical cameras had that the Phase 1 XT really helped solve is before, when I was talking about Copal shutters, right? So the Copal shutter, this is nerd. This is a tech talk for sure, because I get excited about shutters. So you guys have to deal with my enthusiasm a little bit. But in previous technical cameras, this section, this shutter, used to be a Copal shutter. The Copal shutter is completely mechanical. And it actually, you had to use a PC port from the Copal shutter and actually have an external cable go from the shutter to the digital back. Oftentimes, depending on the way the digital back worked, you might need more than one cable. And so sometimes what would happen is that you'd have this cluster of cables coming from the lens into the digital back, and it just didn't, it was, sometimes the cables would fail, sometimes you'd lose them. It was just kind of a pain, but you go through that because that was really the only way that you could have extraordinary lenses like this matched with the highest resolution digital backs in the world. So a lot of photographers kind of dealt with that, but it was a pain for a while. The XT completely solves those problems. While I had the body by itself, you likely saw some contacts, some physical contacts at the bottom of the back and the bottom of where the lens attaches. That's for electronic pass-through. This camera isn't just a metal frame. It actually has cables and wires running through it so that the digital back, which again controls literally every aspect of this camera, can talk adequately to the lens and really more importantly to the shutter itself, because that shutter and digital back were meant for each other. It's a good match. And the IQ4 digital back is really the only back that can control the X shutter itself. And so controlling things like aperture, shutter speed, whether you're in a timed shooting mode like for time lapse using HDR functionality, all of that's done through the digital back, through the internal electronics of the camera, and delivered, that information gets delivered to the lens. And so instead of having a cluster of cables hanging off, you have a completely streamlined, this is it. This is all I need to do to have out to take an image. I don't have a XQD card in there right now, but that's all I would need essentially, is to capture an image, click a button up here instead of a plunger like before, kind of like the plunger, but that's me personally. But this button is so easy and it's so simple and it's so intuitive, because what happens with what Phase 1 has done is actually one of my favorite features of the XT, is that even though it has this historical context to it, this these overtones of designs and techniques from film days, it still has a very much modern feel to it, both in terms of build quality as well as functionality, like with the shutter button. So for example, like the digital back itself, it has absolutely no, I mean, there's every part of the digital back is what controls this camera system. And so if you're using this camera system to compose, you're looking at the digital back and you're looking at the refresh rate of the screen, which is really good. You have everything that you're doing is going to be by touch. So whether or not you have a specific feature you want to use, you're using the entire digital back for that, and you're relying on it, which is a good thing because it's actually really well built. It's high quality. The touch screen is high quality, and it's really not a hindrance, which is a wonderful thing. So we're talking about digital back, the body itself, which has, I've already mentioned the body's shift and rise and fall functionality. There's also, I do want to discuss the lenses one more time. We talked about the X shutter a little bit and how it's much easier and actually faster. So the X shutter itself, Copal shutter is maxed out at roughly a 500th of a second. The X shutter goes up to 1,000th of a second. So not only is it replacing a decades old technology, but it's also improving on it dramatically. So that's something that certainly deserves to be mentioned. The XT body itself has it was built truly in partnership with a company based in the Netherlands called Cambo. Cambo, they're a great technical camera manufacturer, and when you have accessories from a manufacturer like Cambo that is also compatible with the Phase 1 XT, that really expands that that product line even further. Including that also includes certain lenses that are already available. Certain lenses with tilt swing panels, they can be used. Many of them can be used with the XT itself. So not only do you have rise and fall, like true large format style movements, but you also have front standard with those lenses, front standard tilt and swing movements. They're an additional option, but it's a good thing to know that it is available for a true technical camera. That's a big deal. The other thing I mentioned about stitching, or excuse me, about perspective correction, is these movements, these rise and fall movements that you're seeing are really effortless on the digital back. You see that there's not a ton of movement going on. And if you're familiar with large format style cameras, then you know why that's the case. Because and I would show you on the screen, but I don't think you're going to be able to really truly see it. As you make those movements, you're truly changing the composition, the composition itself of the final image. But what you're not changing is the location of the image circle. Let's talk about that for a second. It's a tech talk, so it's going to get a little nerdy, but bear with me. So when let's say you're out in the landscape and you've got a scene in front of you, and the only way to get it right is to do a panorama, right? You have to create a panoramic image to capture all of this insane beauty that you've got in front of you, right? Well, in a traditional system, if you're doing it really right, then you've got a tripod with a panning ability, and you've lined up your camera meticulously on what's called the nodal point of the lens, so that as you rotate the camera to capture all of these different images and put together this huge panorama, nothing is actually moving in the frame itself, but your camera is moving this entire time. And so that's okay. That's a completely fine way to do it. But that nodal to even just meticulously put your lens at the nodal point, at the point where that head is turning, that takes a lot of work. and not everybody has that equipment. But when you're looking at a system like this, when you've got a fully stationary front standard, right? Front standard is where the lens is. When you've got a fully stationary front standard, but your rear standard has the ability to move around, then it's doing something very different. If you were to move the lens around slightly, if you were to not be perfectly on your nodal point, as you move your camera around, taking your panoramic images, there are going to be subtle things moving in the background. It's called parallax. Oftentimes, again, if you're not perfectly on your nodal point, as you turn your camera, what is in front of this lens is constantly changing. And the relationship objects have in your scene to this front standard is changing as that front standard, as that lens changes position. Okay, so unless you've got it perfectly on your nodal point, there are going to be mismatches in your frame and your parallax error that you're going to have to ask software to figure out for itself. Sometimes, most of the time, it does a pretty good job of that. Sometimes it doesn't, though. And if it's a really complicated scene where there is a lot of foreground elements, as well as midground elements and background elements, not only do those items change in relationship to in the final image to the position of the front lens, but they also change in relationship to each other. And so by turning a little bit, you kind of see a little bit behind maybe at one foreground element, and then a little bit more, maybe you see behind a little bit of a midground element. And those changes over time start to stack up. Now, this solves that problem. So when you're setting up and composing in a landscape, a camera system like this, you might say, all right, if I position, I'll say it's this scene behind me. If I've got this scene exactly the way I want it, right? But I know that I'm gonna need to stitch. I'm gonna need to make a much larger image. Instead of loosening this pan head and making images as you typically would, moving in a rotation like this, changing all of those different features, we have the ability to leave that front standard completely stationary, this front lens completely stationary, but have an insane amount of movement on the rear standard and the digital back. So what's happening here? Why does this move and it's not a big deal? Whereas if the front standard moved, it is such a big deal. So the difference is, the reason why there are several large format cameras with front standard shift and horizontal movement and rise fall. But typically what you find is that most people will want those movements to be on the back. The reason for that is that the lens, what every lens does, how cameras work, is you've got a lens that will project, it will see what's in front of it, it will be focused in the middle and then projected onto the sensor. You know, we call that projection, we call an image circle. And so let's say that the image circle is this large, right? So it's this large, and the sensor itself in this large image circle is only about this small, right? It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but for conversation's sake. And so if you have an image circle, which is this large, it's a projection of what's in front of the camera, then you've got a lot of real estate. You can move that sensor within that stationary image circle and do a lot of different things. You can put together a perfectly stitched image without any parallax error whatsoever, because you're moving a sensor around a stationary image circle. Nothing is changing except the canvas, which you're moving around a projection. And so thinking about it in those terms, that's why the rear standard movements on the Phase 1 XT are so effective. And that's what gives you that parallax-free stitching ability. So not only is it fantastic for keystone correction, I don't do a ton of keystone correction in camera because I typically don't need to, but what I do use often is this shifting ability to stitch together images and to create some potentially enormous files. I mean, already the native raw file size that comes out of a camera like this is the native raw size is already over essentially 30 by 40 inches. That's enormous. And so when you've got a larger file than that, and then you can expand that to an even greater level before you start seeing degradation, it just becomes an enormous, huge thing. And so that's a single file. When you've stitched it together, you could have essentially a print the size of a house that wouldn't fall apart when you get really close to it. So that's part of why this camera is built the way it is and does the things that it does. Is a body like this and the lens design the way that it is, it's meant to just bring out every bit of image quality out of this digital back, because digital backs like this are very demanding. If you put a poor quality lens in front of a high resolution medium format digital back, it's not going to look as sharp as it could. The sensor sees more than that. And so if you have to have high quality glass in front of a sensor of the resolution that this is. And so fortunately, these lenses, they fit the bill. For those of you that are in the know, you might recognize this lens as the 32 millimeter Rhodey. This is the 32 millimeter Rodenstock that has quite the reputation of extraordinary sharpness, essentially everywhere, but also in the corners, in the extreme corners of a wide angle lens. That's not something you hear very often. And the reason why lenses like this and in the design that they are able to provide that corner to corner sharpness for such a demanding digital back, it goes back to this large format style design and the fact that this rear element that goes essentially to right there, it can come so close to the sensor of the digital back that and it's a really unique design that allows it to do that. And because it can do that, that's why the corner sharpness is the way it is for lenses like this 32 millimeter Rodenstock. Now, I was talking about image circles before and moving the camera, moving the digital back around that image circle that's projected by the lens. Different lenses project different sized image circles. So sometimes if it's a really small image circle, you might run into, at the extreme shift, you might run into a little bit of vignetting. That's because the image circle for that particular lens is not as large as it needs to be for the digital back to go to that extreme level. Essentially, most every lens, with perhaps the exception of the 23 millimeter, almost every other lens in Phase 1's repertoire they can be essentially almost completely moved to their extremes on the XT without really any noticeable vignetting. So while there may be some, it's very easily corrected. And that's the other thing that's actually part of the XT that was missing in technical cameras beforehand, is that because this XT has electronic contacts and can pass through communication, we didn't have things before. Like when you would photograph digital back like this with a lens like this, but you had to connect the shutter and the back with a single cable, there was no information that was being transferred. The information that you would have to tell your software in order to optimize it for that particular lens using a lens profile, for example, that all had to be done manually. Well, in this case, the digital back knows 100% what lens was used, and it knows what, if any, like if you apply light fall off correction, it's going to be dialed into Capture One for that very specific lens, which again was just something that we didn't really have before. But now we have it, and now it's automated. So it's a really, really huge deal. And again, that comes from the fact that the XT itself has electronic pass-through electronic contacts, and the built the Phase 1 adaptation, the electronic adaptation of the X shutter itself. So these two things, this bit and this bit, those are really the smart portions of the entire camera. Now you might notice too that there's this sort of interesting rail on the side. It's not just the design element. I do think it looks kind of cool, but it is actually way more than that. So when you're out in the field, and particularly if you've got, if there's bad weather, or if you've got your composition lined up perfectly, you don't want to move anything, but you need a vertical as well as horizontal. You've got it in a horizontal orientation at this point. What this will allow you to do is, by flipping this lock, you can turn the actual entire camera on the tripod without having to remove it. And if you notice, this front element didn't move essentially at all. So not only do you have a super easy way of like changing orientation while you're on a tripod without ever having to take the camera off, but you have the ability to do so while also keeping your almost exact optical center. So the only thing that's changing is your vertical or horizontal to vertical orientation, or vice versa. That's the only thing that's being changed when you have a rail system built in to your camera like this. So again, I'll just do it again. You're in landscape orientation like this, turn it so that it's vertical orientation. And I've got my tripod on rubber feet on this hardwood floor, so the tripod's moving a little bit. But that's the idea, is that you're locked in. You don't want to move at all. Unlock this rail, turn it, and now you have the exact same composition, but just in a different orientation. That's a big piece of why this camera system is as good as it is and as flexible as it is, because it gives you all of these things at your fingertips. Basic things like how do you focus or change certain items like that. It's on a helical, so it actually will turn. There are these two, you can kind of pick them out there. There are two little handles, I'll call them handles, that are on a helical, and you change your focus simply by turning them. There are depth markings on this little clamp that's there. And you can actually remove that clamp if you don't like that. If you don't like these guys and you just want to do it by fingertips, you can remove that as well. And you can also remove this little foot. So the way I have the XT on the tripod right now is, again, a built-in feature. So put the tripod away. So the XT itself comes with a built-in Arca-Swiss foot, and so it's a typical Arca-Swiss rail, and all of my heads are Arca-Swiss. The heads themselves aren't Arca-Swiss, but they follow that standard for quick release plates. This one's built in. If you don't have an Arca-Swiss quick release plate, or Arca-Swiss isn't just your system, there's also a 3/8 inch screw at the bottom with a 1/4-20 adapter as well, so you can throw your own quick release plates or anything like that on as well. But the built-in features like this, and also the ability to rotate that and have that as another hand holding point, to be able to throw that on a tripod quickly after doing some handheld shooting, which is so much easier to do now with like a single button, like a blue button, like it's on a DSLR. That's all that's needed to take an image. So you can really, while I personally rarely take the camera off of the tripod, you absolutely could. And this is the simplest technical camera to use via handheld that I've ever seen in my entire life, because it's simply that pass-through electronic communication, single press of a shutter button, a half press. This is crazy to me. A half press of the shutter button will automatically turn on the live view of the digital back so you can compose. Even just that little feature, that blew me away, because this is a camera that behaves so differently from most other camera systems. But to have that just like little creature comfort of a half press to bring up the live view on the digital back is, I just thought that was incredible. So that's kind of a rough overview of the camera. We have substantially more to talk about. Anybody have? I'll look quickly if you have questions for me yet, and I can try to answer some of those that already haven't been answered. Okay, so Mike asked, what do you think how much angle of view you get with the 32mm and the full movement? So it's a great question. With the full movement, it's kind of hard to say. With maxed out movement with the 32mm, I don't have the numbers in front of me. The 32mm lens. So for those of you that may not already be familiar with this fact, this is a larger than 35mm camera, right? So when I showed that digital back and that huge sensor, typically when we think of sensor sizes and crop factors, we think of going from full frame to a smaller size sensor like APS-C or micro four thirds. And we typically, if we have a 50mm lens, we'll have to multiply a 1.6 or something to get the field of view to get a 50mm to 35mm, or excuse me, a 50mm lens on a full frame camera to a 50mm lens on APS-C sized sensor. Suddenly that smaller sensor makes a more narrow field of view. So that's why you multiply by a number greater than 1. 1.6, your 50 millimeter field of view is now smaller because you have a physically smaller sensor. The opposite of true with medium format. So if a 50 millimeter lens looks just like this on a 35 millimeter camera system, then as you increase in size and you have a medium format size sensor now, what you see here expands and becomes actually even wider than you would think. So for example, this 32 millimeters, f equals 32, but as far as the field of view and what we would actually expect to see if we had the same lens on a 35 millimeter camera system, it'd be more like a 24 millimeter lens. And so thinking about it in those terms, a 24 millimeter lens racked to both sides and every corner of the available movement range of the digital back, gosh, you may be looking at something like 14 plus millimeters. It's hard for me to say. I am terrible at, I'm a nerd, but I'm bad at math. So I don't know how that works out. But it's big. So that's an extreme one. Can the Phase 1 XT be used in extreme weather, such as polar regions? Temperatures are often below zero. Leila, that's a great question. And if you look on Phase 1's website, they actually have a few videos of one in particular of a gentleman taking this exact not this exact camera, but the XT to Alaska and shooting in frigid temperatures. And so the answer to that question is yes. It doesn't have the rigorous amount of weather sealing that some other camera systems do. So it's important, to protect it and do due diligence while you're out there. But it is possible. One of the reasons why that is possible, and one of the things that you can, and again, I think the actual operating conditions are like to 32 degrees, but it's been done when it's much colder than that. As far as what was I going to say? So one of the reasons that cold weather is less of an issue for this kind of camera is that in truth, this camera has two shutters. I made a big deal about the X shutter and how that was an improvement over Copal that was used for decades and all this other stuff. There's another shutter in this camera system that is way more recent. The technology behind it is way more recent. And that is the electronic shutter found in the digital back. So this digital back itself has the ability to use an electronic shutter. The shutter will, the actual physical X shutter will remain open, and the CMOS sensor will scan down itself, and that's how an image is recorded. So if you don't want to use the X shutter, if you are using if you've cobbled something together and have a really unique lens without a shutter itself, you can use the electronic shutter. The electronic shutter has a 60th of a second rolling shutter effect. So it's not perfect for every solution, but for landscape, absolutely. Small movements like leaves moving really quickly, doesn't matter at all. You only see anything when somebody like walks all the way across frame at a brisk pace. Then they may start on one side and end on another side. But for landscape, like we're talking about right now, architecture, studio, none of that matters. And while we're talking about the electronic shutter, there was a question earlier. Somebody had asked about the electronic frame averaging. So I think this is as good a time as any to start talking about the digital back. And while so much, research and development and decisions went behind the lens and the X shutter itself and the camera body, all of those physical moving parts, as well as the time taken to create those systems, they're nothing if you don't have a good sensor behind it, and you don't have good processors, and you don't have good ways of capturing images. Fortunately, the digital back does all of those things, and it does them really well. So the digital back that we're using right now is the Phase 1 IQ4 150 megapixel. The IQ4 digital back is the only digital back that will use, or that is capable of controlling the X shutter like we've talked about. So the IQ4 150 CMOS sensor digital back, 150 megapixels, 15 stops of dynamic range, and extraordinarily good ISO performance, particularly for a medium format camera system. Some of the features that really make this back special is the fact that I mentioned it before. Phase 1 has the ability to send information to this digital back via firmware updates and create tools and ways of capturing images that just didn't have before. And so even now, the time between when the XT was released and where it is today, it's become a different camera without any new physical pieces. New things have been added to the IQ4 digital back that the XT camera can take advantage of. One of those things is frame averaging. So the gentleman asking about frame averaging, essentially the idea behind a frame averaged image is that as let's say you photograph a 30-minute long exposure, right? So you've got a long exposure, 30 minutes. That's a really difficult exposure to really wrangle, especially if it's already a high contrast scene. If you do a 30-minute exposure during the middle of the day, and if you have any bright highlights, you can kiss those highlights goodbye, because the longer exposure that you have, it's additive. More and more and more and more and more light is being added to those highlights in a long exposure. Whereas in a frame averaged image, what the IQ4 digital back does is, instead of having a 30-minute exposure, it will take many exposures over the course of 30 minutes. And then it averages those images together. That does a couple things. One, it mimics a long exposure, right? So we're used to seeing in long exposures, 30 minutes is pretty extreme, but we'll just say, for conversation's sake, a 30-minute exposure of a waterfall, that water's going to be smoothed out, really nice flowing lines. The frame averaging does the exact same thing. The difference in a frame averaged image is that you can photograph that entire 30 minutes, and the exposures that the camera makes could be at a base ISO of 50, they could be at a high ISO of 800. It doesn't truly, and the shutter speeds could be at maybe a 1/25th of a second. But if you're photographing many, 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 many times over the course of those 30 minutes, you blend together, and this all happens in camera. So you blend together potentially thousands of images that were taken at ISO, let's say 800 at 1/25th of a second. A standard image like that, you might see noise. It's not going to be the best looking image, but it should look fine. But when they're all stacked together and compressed and averaged, what was this potentially noisy image is now as smooth and as buttery as a base ISO 30-minute exposure, essentially noiseless. And again, it's capturing all of these different frames at short shutter speeds, averaging them together. And the benefit to that as well is that it's not additive like a long exposure is. My example before, when we were talking about a 30-minute exposure and you've got highlights in that frame, the longer that exposure is, the more those highlights are just going to get burned out. And so oftentimes they're just going to be completely gone by the end of it, even if the rest of the elements in your image are properly exposed. With a frame averaged image, every image is that 1/25th of a second. So as long as you've got good shadow detail and you've got good highlight detail in that single image, when you take thousands more and you combine them all together, it's going to look like a 30-minute exposure in terms of smoothness, clouds moving, whatever it is, but those highlights are going to be protected. And those highlights are going to stay put exactly where they are. So you can, if they're a little hot in post, you can bring them down so much easier and with so much more intensity and so much more form than they would have had otherwise. So that frame averaging function is a really big deal. It uses that electronic shutter exclusively. The shutter simply remains open and the digital back does all of the work. Another feature that's being put into, it already has been put into the IQ4 digital back is the what's called, now I'm spacing on it. I can't remember the name of the tool now. I'll think of it later. But essentially what it does, dual exposure plus. So dual exposure plus kind of does what it sounds like. Thanks, Murray. So dual exposure plus essentially gives you the ability to, or what it does is that when you capture an image, the back will take an exposure at the exposure you've designated, but then it'll also do another one automatically in the background at 3 stops higher, at 3 stops more exposed than your initial correct exposure. The benefit to that is that in camera, it combines these 2 raw files. And so while it will look initially like your proper exposure that you set first, when you bring it into Capture One and you start raising blacks and you start raising shadows, where you can go further than you would have ever thought before. because there's it's like an HDR capture already combined for you in a standard raw file that you don't have to do anything else to. It's all of that information's already in there, and then you just simply bring it out and capture one, and you bring it out in post. Now, dual exposure plus feature is it's basically black magic. I've tested it, and it is absolutely amazing what you can do with it. And not only so, that's just the back itself. But when you have computational photography features like that, and you are pushing a single capture beyond what it ever was able to be before, and then you've got the stitching capability and the tilt swing lens option and the extraordinary optics behind these rodent stock lenses that Phase One has partnered with. It's an amazing camera system. And I have to say, like, when you're out in the field and you take these trips that sometimes you may not ever go on again, landscape photography is wrought with once in a lifetime opportunities. That's just the way it is. And what I hate more than anything else is to be out there to have the light happen in front of me. And either I don't have what I need to capture it adequately, or I do have what I need, but the file itself, I know because I've used these camera systems for, coming on a decade, that I don't have what I could have if I didn't have this with me. Every landscape image I take that isn't photographed with a medium format camera system, sort of like this, I have to be honest, for my own work, has an asterisk next to it, because, and I know that sounds bad, but like, I know that it could have been better, and that file could have been more than what it is with a system that's different than this. That's all there is to it, because of these computational features and the exceptional blending of these computational digital features and the physical movements and the physical optical quality of these lenses and the resolution of the digital back. They come together to make this just sort of monster of an image quality machine. And that's truly what it is. I feel pretty strongly about it, because there's nothing more fun to me than to sort of have this slower, more methodical approach. Because you think about it, if you go out in the landscape, you're probably not going to set a camera system with this much control up anywhere and just take a snap and leave. You're not gonna look at something, make a quick image, and then move on. You could, but when you have a system like this that sort of, because of the controls, it is just begging you to take control and to make decisions. Because in landscape photography, it's about that corner to corner matters. If there's a branch coming in a particular corner, that could throw off the composition. If you've got a rock where it's not supposed to be, or this is the perfect framing, but if I could move everything without adjusting anything else, if I could just shift this way, it'd be perfect. A camera system like this, the Phase One XT, it does those things. I was shooting just the other day. I was in Colorado photographing some hoodoos, and it was amazing. I could frame up an image, and I would notice that my tripod's down, I'm locked in. Then I noticed that there's like a little something coming in the frame, and I could either uproot this tripod on very uneven ground and spend 15 minutes getting it back to level again, or I could shift like that. That's all I have to do. No loss of image quality, no nothing. It's all done in camera, and we have the entire resolution. That's a really big deal. But when you have that kind of a camera system that gives you that ability, and you have a camera system that puts tools in your hands like shift and rise and fall, and potentially even tilt and swing with frame averaging functionality and dual exposure plus for shadows being brought out into some potentially really dark images, bringing those shadows out. It is begging you to make those decisions and really put something together that's incredible. And I love that. I love that approach. I love the idea of setting a camera on a tripod, slowing down, taking in the scene, having patience to wait for light, and to have my composition exactly the way I want it to. And then the things that I don't have control over, I just wait for, and I let them happen. Light, weather, whatever that is, now that I've got my control down and the things that I do have control over, I've exercised to their greatest extent and I've got my shot. Now I can just wait, press a button, and I've got an image that is just about as good as I could probably ever create. It's simply in terms of the resolution and file size and the acuity that these lenses are able to provide. This camera will not take great images for you. It is not, if you point it at something, it's not guaranteed to look great. But when you are methodical, as it encourages you to do, as the workflow of the system encourages you to be methodical, if you give it that time, oh my goodness, it's an experience unlike any other. Not to overstate it, but you know, I'm a nerd, so I kind of like it. I'm going to look at some more questions. So if you guys have more questions about the system, about shooting in the field, let me know, and I'm happy to answer those for you. I'm going to scan through real quick. Can you use the X shutter if you want over the electronic shutter, Larry? Yes, absolutely. So in the digital back, you can choose exactly which shutter you would like to use. If for whatever reason that the electronic shutter is going to be your best bet for a particular shot, you can turn off the X shutter entirely, and vice versa is also the case. What else do we have? Also, hey, Larry. Let's see. Light spill and indoors well controlled only. So Marek asks if the CMOS sensor is really any different in how it accepts light from a CCD sensor in something like an older back, like in a Leaf Aptus 2.5, for example. And the answer to that is, and if I understand your question correctly, the answer is resounding yes. So this gets even more technical, but essentially what I was referring to before in terms of image circle is when you would have an image circle from a particular lens, the rear element of these lenses can sit really close to the sensor, right? And so that's a good thing, because then the acuity, that's how we get sharpness in the corners for ultra wide angle lenses. So that's a really good thing for us. But the problem though is that as that rear element gets very close to the sensor, light still has to come from a small rear element and expand to cover the entire image circle to create a large enough image circle to move around in. In older pairings of lenses and digital backs, what that would create are these color casts around the image. So you'd have to, and they're all most all correctable, but you know, there's magenta or green or in a corner where you really didn't want them to be. With the IQ4 150, the IQ4 150 has what's the phrasing for it? So it's a backside illuminated CMOS sensor, and that backside illumination essentially it sometimes completely removes, other times the need for, other times drastically lessens the need for something like an LCC or lens cast calibration. Straight out of the camera, the images look beautiful. So to answer your question, Marek, yes, the backside illuminated CMOS sensor particularly of the IQ4 150 is a drastic change over older CCD sensors that use different technologies. Fernando asks, where does this power supply of the digital back come from? What format are the recorded images? And what type is the memory or storage? So great questions, Fernando. The power source for the digital back is a BP915 styled battery. It's one of these guys. And this is the only power source. The X shutter is powered from this as well. So all you need to do is drop this, throw another one in there, and then you are back off to the races. As far as the format of the images themselves, the digital back shoots in RAW, and it shoots in .iiq files. That .iiq designation stands for Intelligent Image Quality, and they've been using that for several years now. The only recommended software to use for files like this, the only software that's really capable of taking advantage of the files that this thing is able to spit out, is Capture One. So Capture One, any files shot with this, bring them into Capture One. Capture One immediately knows what's going on It knows what the digital back is meant to do. It knows what the lens is meant to do, and it knows how they should be speaking together and how they should talk in terms of image quality together. So you have all of that built in, again, which was not available before in older technical cameras. Your other question, with the storage medium, you have on the side door here, we have a space for SD as well as XQD. And I believe CFast is can also be used with the XQD, but I am not 100% on that yet. I'll have to get back on that. So Fernando asks, can you shoot tethered? Yes, absolutely. So there's actually multiple tethering options for the IQ4, which is a really cool thing. We have USB-C out right here. That's going to provide the most power to the digital back as well. So it can accept power from the computer as well as speak to each other and negotiate power like proper USB-C can. You also have Ethernet, and you also have power over Ethernet. So not only do you have the Ethernet ability to use just cables that are just insanely long, but you can also draw power over that Ethernet connection, which is huge. And lastly, you also have a Wi-Fi tethering ability. Now, as you can imagine, these 120 megabyte files, by the way, 120 megabyte files roughly for 150 megabyte or 150 megapixel camera system, you're doing pretty good. 120, 140, I've seen file sizes coming out of way smaller camera systems be much larger and have a much greater strain on storage options than a 150 megapixel camera system. The compression, the lossless compression that comes out of this digital back is actually really something. Marek asks, can this back be used with the Mamiya Phase 1 DF? So the IQ4 is really designed to be used with the XF camera system. So the XF is the graduated form of the DF. The XF is really sort of designed from the ground up between, really Phase 1's input and that ability, and it really is the only way to control the digital back properly. So and I believe I don't even think it's possible to control a DF with the IQ4. The IQ4 must be married with the XF. And Murray, correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I believe that's correct. Fernando, while tethered through Wi-Fi, what is the minimum internet requirement? So it doesn't necessarily have to go through internet. As long as you have a broadband wireless system in your home or studio or wherever, it can send those files. And like I said, it's 140 megs roughly per raw file. But that's not that bad. It'll take a while to get over via Wi-Fi, but it's actually really cool to have that in the background. So you've captured an image, it'll store to the card, and also you can have that image stored at the same time to the SD card if you so choose. And you can also have that image go straight to your computer via USB-C if you wanted to. So it's nice to capture an image, know that it's already backed up twice, and then using Wi-Fi to back it up again to your machine. So by a single press of a shutter, you essentially have the potential to have 3 different backups every shot, which is kind of great. No problem, Fernando, you got it. What else? What else do we have going on here, guys? What other questions can I answer for you? I wanted to kind of leave 30 minutes or so for questions. So about how this camera system works and whatever its features are, how it will pair with Capture One, anything like that, I'm here for you. So just feel free to ask. Let's see. Brent, so earlier asked, can you tell us the focal length of the longer lenses? So Brent, the Phase 1 is actually still partnering with Rodenstock and producing new lenses for the XT. So the longest focal length right now is, I believe it's 90 millimeters, which is roughly 80 millimeter equivalent in 35 millimeter terms. There are longer options coming, and substantially longer options coming as well. The trick to having those longer lenses is getting the spacing correct for these large format style lenses, and so it kind of protrude out a decent amount. But a longer focal length, I love longer focal lengths on medium format cameras because it just is exploding with quality and exploding with sharpness. When that space is compressed, that visual space is tightened and compressed, the resolution really has an opportunity to show you some things that you didn't even know were there. And I absolutely love that. Joel asked, how well does the camera function in low light? Would it be good for doing astro and landscape photography? So we've actually used it for that in the past. The lenses that come with the Phase 1 are not, or that come with the XT specifically, are not exceptionally fast. We're not talking about 1.8 or 2. Well, there are some 2.8s, but we're not really getting into the 1.8s. It's less about speed and super narrow depth of field as a consequence. For lenses like this, it's really more about resolution and how well can this lens render a scene and give you the most depth of field possible for a medium format digital camera like this. Now, that being said, they are capable of taking Milky Way images. The frame averaging, me and a colleague did a test. Well, he did the test, but it was kind of our idea to put the digital back on and the XT on like a star tracker, and while also using the frame averaging ability, which works very similarly to star stacking astrophotography software, which combines images so that there's more signal and less noise. That's a feature that's essentially built into the digital back, and so we kind of had the idea to like put it on a star tracker and see what kind of resolution we can get, what kind of image quality we can get out of the stars. It's typically not what they're designed for, but stars in landscapes, absolutely possible. It truly is, and especially with tools like frame averaging and dual exposure plus, those shadows that would have been potentially filled with noise, bringing them up further than you ever really thought possible with those two features really makes an incredible difference, for sure. Can you use, Mike asked, can you use a power bank via USB-C? Yes, you can. So if you've got and I've done that before several times actually, if you've just got like a little additional battery bank, yeah, plug that directly into the USB-C. And I believe it can pull, I have to look at my spec sheet to be completely sure, but I know that the back is capable of it's capable of pulling at least 3 amps, or not, like at most 3 amps, if I'm not mistaken, from a battery bank. If it can produce that much power and send that much power via USB-C, the digital back can take it. And at 3 amps, that's probably going to be enough to power the back essentially all day. So that is definitely something that you could have in your back pocket, literally in your back pocket, and potentially without having to have a bunch of additional batteries, one larger battery bank, and you're good to go for sure. Oh, hey, my presentation. So yeah, I had this set up for you guys and just talking and kind of forgot about it. I do have some images that I can show you that this one doesn't really give you a ton of information, but I do have some images that I shot with the XT using some of its features that I think are really worth mentioning. So yeah, Bruce, the 90 and the 70 have the largest image circles, and yeah, you can essentially rack that rear standard out fully before ever really seeing those. The 32 itself has a really large image circle. The smallest, I believe, is the 23, which, and if you think about it in those terms, a 23mm lens on a large full frame medium format camera system, it's about 14mm. So that's already a crazy wide lens for a system like this. And then you can still shift and have some rise fall within that, not fully racked, but absolutely, I've done it before, and it's pretty impressive. So I was going to scroll through some of these during the talk, but this kind of gives you a better look at the camera itself and what it looks like. So this lens that is on the screen right now is the Rodenstock 90mm, and so it has a fairly long distance to go, 90mm, from the nodal point of that lens to the sensor itself. And that lens is fairly large, but it's a really high quality lens, very, very, very sharp. We also have another image of the camera that's turned 90 degrees like we had it before. So that integrated rail really does make a big difference when you're switching from horizontal to vertical orientation out in the field. And then just the standard orientation from the side. This is kind of the profile. And I want to Merrick asked, is the shutter located in the nodal point? I'm not exactly sure of the nodal point location in these specific lenses. might be able to get that information though. So for these kinds of lenses, you kind of get the idea of a silhouette. You know, it's a really, I wrote an article about this a little while ago, but when you use a camera that looks like this one does, and that looks so different from other camera systems, but doesn't look different just to look different, it's actually solving unique problems with unique solutions. And when you have a camera that looks so different, it's a pleasure to pick it up. Like, it's just fun to use. And and that's why I love it so much too, because it still harkens back to the methodical, slow, purposeful composition, the purposeful framing, purposeful photography, putting your hands on actual things, actual physically moving parts, even in a very highly digital environment still. I love that. I love the time that takes and the tactility. I honestly think it puts you in the scene more. It puts you in that location, and it makes you more a part of the image, at least in my mind. Those are a lot. I mean, you know, you can talk all day about you know, intangibles in a particular camera system, and it's going to be different from everyone. But that's certainly what I get out of it. And when I shoot out with this camera, it is a satisfying experience that I don't have with the other cameras that I own. So you know, it sounds trivial, and you're probably not buying this camera just because of the way it looks, but it's a part of it. And if you're using it professionally, showing up on a job that with a camera system that your client has never seen before, that's kind of interesting. That makes them remember you in a way. So while certainly not the leading advantage of a camera like this, it's an intangible that, in my opinion, is very real. So something to just kind of think about and consider. Pretty bokeh images of the XT kind of lounging in its natural environment. So this is kind of a nice top view. This kind of gives you an idea of what the window is for looking exactly at how much shift that you have available. So I mentioned you've got roughly 12 millimeters of horizontal shift in either, so 24 millimeters total, 12 in either direction. So as you move that top scroll wheel, you'll see that white dot. It's currently on the 0. You'll see that white dot move. And so you can see exactly how far over you've come. The thing that's really cool about this is because the XT and the X shutter talk to each other through the XT digital back, or excuse me, goodness, because the digital back talks to the lens through the XT body, the movements that you're making and the horizontal 5 millimeters of shift, 5 millimeters of rise, and if you're stitching a few different images, then suddenly you've got, not only do you have an image ready to be stitched that's huge, but each image has that information in its metadata, and you can actually see it in real time on the digital back. I'd show you, but it would be really rough through the webcam. But as you turn on the back and you look at its live view and you make these movements, you'll see 5 millimeter increments start to move, and it's a really interesting thing. So that's been a really nice feature. Also, we have the same kind of window on the right-hand side. So you can, as you move the back up and down, you also have that window so where you can see the exact position in looking at the camera, as well as if you're just looking at the digital back, you see that digitally, and all of that information is there in the metadata. So I do have some images that I actually shot recently with the XT. I love this camera system, and I love environments like this, but environments like this are exceptionally challenging to photograph in. There's so much to look at. There's so many textures. There's so many things happening visually all at the same time. It can be somewhat chaotic. And I actually really enjoy trying to, you see those chaotic scenes, taking the time to compose and trying to sort of translate that chaos into something that's actually really pleasing to look at. So these are some images shot with the XT that I took recently that I'm fairly happy with. And I do want to show, so this is a 100% view of from the image just previous. So I'll go back. So if you look at, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but if you can see, you know, if you look just to the center right, you kind of see this this rock formation that's somewhat in the distance. This is a 100% view of that rock formation. And you can see that there's an exceptional level of detail in this really tight crop. And again, we're dealing with a 150 megapixel camera system. I don't know how well that's rendering through time and space, but it's exceptionally sharp. I can guarantee you that. And some more images. So again, it's the XT giving, this is sort of an example of the XT giving me the ability to have the control to move the back within a stationary image circle and finding the composition exactly as I want it to be without losing quality. That's what's happening here. And I love these landscapes that have these subtle tones that, but again, they can be really chaotic and they have leading lines that can come from interesting places. And so if you can subtly fine tune your composition as well as stitch, but it's even just using it to change subtle composition notes, and then instead of physically grabbing your entire tripod and moving it and shaking everything and adjusting everything at the same time, that's a big deal. Those are really important things to think about. And so moving the camera, moving tripods will always change. It changes everything, changes composition, jostles things. But if you're able to keep things still and use just that rear back for subtle movements and subtle changes to get things exactly the way you want it, that's an intense level of control that not many camera systems can provide, period. That's all there is to it. So I've got just one or two more of these, but I think this next one, oh, no, not this one, one more. Here's another 100% view coming up. So if you look at the rock sort of in the middle, if you find the middle of the frame and look to your left, there's a rock on the left-hand side. That's a 100% view of that rock. And again, I don't know how that's coming through via the webinar, but on my screen, I can see dust particles on this rock. And I can see detail and color and subtleties and changes and subtle differences in tonality that I honestly don't believe would be there otherwise. So it makes a huge difference in that way. Marek asks, what about color profiling? What tools do you need to get color accuracy? Capture One has an exceptionally powerful color editing tool that you can create your own ICC profiles from. So that's typically what I do. And I like that workflow because I have total control. And each time, let's say it's a particular product with a particular color, I can save that ICC profile and apply it to future images or assign it to that particular camera. So that's useful as well. And this is the last image that I have in the talk. This is actually a stitch. So again, it's just put the camera down, position it in the rough composition that you want, and then using the stitching ability of the digital back, you create an easily stitched, parallax-free panorama. Like you ask Photoshop to put this together for you, and it's gonna just say no problem because it's already there. It has to do so much less math to fix parallax error and make tonality and gradient adjustments that don't need to happen when you've got shift and rise and fall movement. So if panoramas are something that you do a lot and large images with a good deal of resolution, something seriously to consider is this kind of ability because it makes an enormous difference and can create files that are exceptional in terms of both color, dynamic range, resolution. I mean, until you've seen an image at scale, an enormous image that doesn't fall apart inches away from your eye, it's hard to truly describe. So web resolution can only do so much, but you know, it's a pretty impressive thing when it's done correctly. Yeah. I think we have like 6 minutes left or so. Is that right, Murray? Correct. Okay, yeah, so that's essentially my talk. If you guys have questions for Murray, let us know. I think now's the time. And I think we also have a photo enhancement, right?
We do. We have a giveaway here coming up shortly. So yeah, please go ahead and ask any questions you might have of Zach, and we'll get to the contest momentarily.
I'm looking through older questions, so I'm just scrolling up through the chat. Okay, so Guy had asked about the frame averaging a while back, and he asked a question that a section of the question I didn't quite touch on. So he asked, what's the relationship to neutral density filters, if any, and the final expected sharpness? So those are good questions. The frame averaging function, like we were talking about before, exposing for 30 minutes, but taking a bunch of tiny images, short exposures throughout that time, it essentially has the effect of a neutral density filter. Let's say, for example, if you were out photographing and you wanted to have a 30-minute exposure, but you wanted to really protect those highlights, if you were to get that exposure at a quick shutter speed, 1/25th of a second at a certain ISO, that's your exposure. You're locked into that exposure. So you don't have to, like a neutral density filter, the purpose is to darken and cut the light coming through the lens so that you can have a long exposure. Well, when you're using frame averaging, you can have small, much shorter exposures over a long period of time. It's doing essentially the same thing. So with that system, with the frame averaging tool and the IQ4 digital bag, you can leave all your neutral density filters at home.
Okay, I think we're going to go to the photo contest now. If we can bring up that image.
Yeah. Hey, gang.
Hey, Rick.
Oh, that was it. Well, I just love Murray. You and you guys and Zach, you are fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing that to Hawaii. As a tech talk, that was awesome. For people who had never seen this, we really had a lot of attendees who were watching this. And Zach, you are like an encyclopedia, buddy. Hey, we'd like to bring the megapixel photo contest winner up. And Murray, I'd like you to be able to bring that up if you wouldn't be. And here it is.
Here we go. Excellent. So this image was shot by Dylan Macy.
Yeah.
And Dylan, what Dylan has won, I'm not sure if he's on the chat. I didn't notice it earlier, but Dylan has won a free weekend rental of either the XF camera system or the XT camera system.
Wow.
So we'll have to contact him after the fact and give him all the details.
Yeah, I want to know the weekend he gets it because I'm going to assist him. Okay.
I bet you will.
Yeah, nice.
And the reason we chose this image ourselves is, you know, the contest was obviously about the effect of the pandemic on Hawaii, and I think this just kind of says it all. You know, that isolation, that feeling of, I don't know, almost despair. I think we've all felt it, and it's a worldwide thing. It's not just in the U.S. It's not just in, you know, on the island. It's worldwide. So I think this really depicts it quite well. So thank you, Dylan.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Folks, I want to say mahalo to Zach and to Murray. Thank you, and Megapixels in Phase 1. It was great to have you with us. You know, we'd rather give you a hug, but we got to do it this way, so we've enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody. I want to thank all the people, particularly the ones who are joining us that were not in Hawaii. We love to see that. That was really exciting to see that you're coming from different parts of the world, and that makes us really happy. So for now, we're going to wrap, take a little time out. We got Victoria Wright coming up. She's a Lexar ambassador, a wonderful, wonderful woman photographer with some great images. And stay tuned, she'll be back here with us in half an hour. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Murray. Thank you, Phase 1.
Thank you, Rick.
Megapixels.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you all.